Welcome to Biocanic's Health Intelligence Exchange community, where leading practitioners in integrative health approaches will discuss how they solve the most challenging and common health issues. These regular Q&A discussions are designed to take a deep dive into case studies and integrative approaches in order to elevate the collective knowledge of both experienced and new practitioners alike. Biocanic's Health Intelligence Exchange, your community for functional medicine.
Welcome to the Health Intelligence Exchange, everyone. I'm Laini Gray from Biocanic, and today I'm joined by Courtney Cowie from FDN Consults. Hi, Courtney. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Laini?
Good. I'm glad to be here. Today, we're going to discuss case studies from the FDN Consults Vault. And for those of you joining live today, we will transition to a live Q&A toward the end. So feel free to start posting questions in the comments below. Courtney's primary goal is to help her clients restore their sense of self and experience trust and faith in their capacity to heal and experience a fulfilling life, which is pretty darn amazing. Within this goal, Courtney aims to offer her clients hope that they can achieve their health goals through natural methods and instill in them confidence to take control of their own health and healing through lifestyle change. She is passionate about educating clients about their health concerns and offering them insight and guidance from the perspectives of functional medicine and nutrition therapy. Today, she's here on behalf of FDN to talk about their consultation programs and some case studies that can help practitioners like you understand more about how this can help your clients with mentoring and clinical insights. Thanks so much for joining us, Courtney. I'm so excited for this conversation. And I'm excited because we've got to cover a lot of things before you go to Disney World next week.
I know. Yeah, we were just talking about that. I'm like excited for that, but it's kind of like pushing my schedule up. So
Exactly. All right, Ms. Courtney, can you start by explaining what FDN consults are and how they support practitioners in their clinical decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. So at FDN, we have a medical director program that's staffed with a number of clinical advisors, which are experienced FDNs that have undergone additional training in functional lab testing. And so it's offered as a service to currently FDN practitioners, but as well Biocanic users that are looking for a second pair of eyes to help them go through their functional lab test, particularly if it's one maybe that they haven't run before or they don't feel totally solid on interpreting and writing a protocol around. And so it's really kind of a service meant to help strengthen the confidence and also solidify just the viability of the recommendations that a practitioner would be giving to their client, so that they have the ability to kind of deepen their knowledge around the particular test that they're getting advising on, and then also just get that extra pair of eyes, as I said. What can be helpful about it is just having another experienced practitioner bring in their insight from their own, ongoing study and learning of the test, as well as like on our staff of clinical advisors, we've got different advisors that specialize in different areas. So some of them are more adept at, say, interpreting hormone testing and working with clients that are struggling with hormonal issues, others more autoimmune stuff. All of us can really like look at all of the tests, but that can be helpful too, just to have that kind of expertise depending on whatever the client case is. Yeah, I feel like it's a great service. We can guide not only just with the test markers and looking at that and interpreting those, but also the foundational recommendations that a practitioner might be looking for some guidance, whether that's nutritionally speaking, lifestyle-wise, the foundations that we really look at FDN, which involve diet, rest, exercise, stress reduction, and of course, supplementation. And so that's basically what the clinical advising sessions are for.
Amazing. And I love that you touched on that about really helping practitioners get a little more insight. Would you say that across the board, whether they're an FDN or a health coach or a physician or a naturopath, that there are practitioners that get a little nervous about different lab tests or when a new marker shows up, and that sense of, oh, I'm not sure how to handle this comes up? And that's probably a really great reason to sign up for an FDN consult?
Absolutely. Yes, 100%, Laini. And I think from my perspective, I see pretty often practitioners come in with testing they might not normally run, and they've got a client that's a little bit outside of maybe their scope of expertise or their scope of focus, and they're really just wanting to make sure that they're understanding the test solidly and they're applying it in a way that makes sense. The other thing is there's just so many updates on tests, like even just to take the GI map, for example, which is a functional stool test that we're all trained in as a foundational test at FDN. There's been a number of just extra markers and updates that have come out in the last year or two on that test. And this is true across the board for a lot of tests, new tests that are coming into the spectrum. And so sometimes it's hard just to stay on top of all of that, and being able to have somebody who's constantly being educated and constantly being trained on different functional testing and different functional lab markers that are coming out can be super, super helpful in cases like that.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. Now, today we're going to shift a little more from what is the consult and how does the consult work to case studies. Now, why are case studies such a valuable tool for practitioners learning how to interpret and apply functional lab testing?
So I think case studies are where our education and our theory really meets the road of real application to clients, right? And so you can learn all of the best information in the world, but half of that piece of success comes in actually applying it with real people and seeing how this information plays out, seeing how these recommendations, these steps play out. And so I feel like case studies basically give credence to the methodology that we're really subscribing to and standing behind as functionally trained practitioners. And I mean, even just personally, I try to make an effort every few months to, record a podcast episode on a client case study just to show what's possible, so that real people out there that aren't aware of, these types of approaches can really gain and build confidence and trust that they have options outside of just the conventional approach to their disease or their chronic illness, whatever it is they're struggling with, right?
Okay, that's great. Because I think it's good to be able to see from someone else's perspective, hey, a client came to me with all of these different situations. I use this testing, I use this methodology, and we're tracking the progress, and this actually works. So that's really powerful. Can you share a memorable case that highlights how functional testing uncovered healing opportunities?
Yeah, 100%. So I'm going to use one that I actually just presented on last month during the FDN Clinical Edge Summit. So in that particular event, I actually highlighted a client that I started with last year who's actually still getting some continuity support from me. Her case was, I'd say, relatively complex in that she had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder affecting her kidneys, which is not something you see every day. And then on top of that, she had other secondary issues going on. She had some gut symptoms and bouts of diverticulosis. She's had diagnosis of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, some of the common, like those are very common in the population. But again, just kind of this overall picture of not feeling the greatest, lots of fatigue. She had weight that she wanted to lose, that she was struggling to lose, and was very proactive and very holistically minded, which always sets the stage for a good foundation for any client. But I think she was also at a point of feeling kind of crummy enough that she didn't have the clarity of mind to really know what to do. And then obviously just the confusion on like, all right, I've tried some things dietarily, but now what? That, where I'm at right now isn't working, and I'm not even entirely sure which approach to take. And so when we started working together, because I got the sense she was a little bit more complex, I decided to run some testing that went outside of just the foundational tests that we run as FDNs, which are always a great place to start. But the more you do the work, I find the more you start to get a bit of an intuition for which testing might be a little bit more appropriate for certain clients and get to the heart of the matter a little bit faster. And so in my population of people I work with, I always run a GI map. Sometimes I'll run a different functional stool test, but because the gut is so centric to the way I approach things, as do most FDNs, of course, we ran that. I actually had decided to have her take the Shoemaker SIRS cluster assessment just to get a read on how she was scoring on that to assess her for biotoxin illness potential. And along with that, the Horowitz MSIDS, which is a kind of a soft but very good assessment that you can give just out of the gate to get kind of an indicator on whether or not the person you're working with might have tick-borne illness. And so both of those side by side were, separate but very helpful biotoxin associated sort of questionnaires. And on both of them, she scored quite high. And so I decided then to go ahead and recommend a urine mycotoxin panel as well as a tick-borne 1.0 from Vibrant Labs. So we got that data as well as a full thyroid panel, because a lot of her secondary concerns, particularly the metabolic ones like the weight loss resistance, the fatigue, I would even say the high cholesterol, high blood pressure, likely had a thyroid imbalance aspect to it. And knowing that biotoxin illness can really be hard on the thyroid, I wanted to know all that. So if I'm remembering correctly, I think those were the 4 tests that I selected for her right out of the gate. And just the way that I've seen things go with the gut and with chronic inflammatory disorders is that if there is a high toxic load, whether that's biotoxin or chemical toxins or metals or whatnot, typically if we don't start to lessen that and resolve that, it can be hard to get other foundations like gut health or, hormonal balance, those types of things to actually come back online appropriately. So I wanted to really get to the deepest root I could potentially identify. And so, yeah, she came back with significant findings on the urine mycotoxin test, several mycotoxins coming back high. Same thing with the tick-borne. She was showing elevated antibodies to several tick-borne, pathogens on that test. And then her GI map was really interesting because I think she not only had C. diff toxin A and B come back, but also, if I remember correctly, I think there was a parasite as well as a lot of bacterial dysbiosis. So, multiple pathogens going on there, which again kind of showed me that her gut was under stress. She had a lot of co-infections that had likely been there for a while, stressing the system, and then setting the stage for things like leaky gut, immune activation, that type of thing. In fact, it was interesting just thinking back on our GI map, there were several species of bacteria, like Proteus being one. There were a few more, I can't remember off the top of my head, that were elevated that, do correlate back to kidney issues, urinary tract issues, those types of things. And so just being able to see there was some degree of like parallel to the systems of her body impacted. And then some of those data points coming back on the labs I ran gave me a lot of confidence that those could be real factors driving some of the dysregulation we were seeing. So as we got those test results back and obviously developed a protocol for her, typically the way I approach things just to get clients going right away and get them some wins as we're waiting for those tests to come back, I looked at her food journal. She was in a pretty okay place, but obviously there was room for improvement. Right up front, we had a conversation around doing more of an elimination diet protocol because she had an overt diagnosis of autoimmune disease. And I had told her about all of the research backing the autoimmune paleo diet to help reduce antibody levels in the body as well as inflammation. And she's like, I'm familiar with that. I think I've actually tried that before. Yes, I'd be willing to do that. So she was very proactive and very willing to move forward into I would say what can be a challenging but very effective dietary protocol. And again, we went into, how are your fats? We looked at the macros. We did all of that work to try to not only get her food triggers out, but focus on nutrient dense whole foods that were compliant within that dietary template, less likely to trigger the immune system. And then the other interesting challenge that I actually mentioned when I was presenting on this case at Clinical Edge Week was that with her particular condition, she had been recommended by her doctor to follow a low protein diet because in her condition, there's a lot of protein spillage that happens that doctors tend to correlate back to dietary protein, making it in excess into the urine, right? And from a functional perspective, I'm not entirely sure if that really does hold water, because what I can tell you is from the point we started, I think she was averaging around 50 grams of protein per day. And now I think she's up to currently between 80 to 100 grams of protein per day and feeling much better at that level. She's still below what she should be based on her weight. Mm-hmm. But what is interesting is her lab markers are not changing. It's not like she's spilling more protein, even though we've increased protein amounts in the diet. So that was an interesting challenge just from a functional perspective, because again, I do find at times we're presented with some of these more complex clients where they're literally being managed by medical doctors and other licensed practitioners, where you really do have to respect the scope and bounds of what they're doing with that client. But figure out a way to come in and support within the context that you can, and honoring some of these limitations like the protein, constraints. She actually decided on her own accord to bump it up, over time based on how she was feeling. So it was still very much a client-led process, but being willing to say, okay, we've got this challenge, let's kind of work with this. And at least if we're bound to a low number of total grams of protein, let's at least try to get you some really good sources of protein, highly absorbable forms of protein, support your body the best we can that way. And, I would say over the last 6 months, especially, she's seen considerable change. Like her energy has gone way up. Her kidney labs are very stable. We aren't necessarily seeing complete reversal of the autoimmune stuff, but I feel like so many of these disease states, it can take decades for these things to show up in the body. It's not necessarily an overnight process. Sometimes it can take months, if not years, for clients to diligently work at reversing those things. She's lost, I think, at least 20 pounds, if not more. I can't remember what her total weight loss, but it was a good amount. She's feeling very energized and able to do more activity than she has been in the last several years. Her cholesterol has come down. I think her blood pressure is in a more normal place. And so in general, she's had a lot of really positive change and been very, very happy with the process. And then did go and retest both the GI map and the urine mycotoxin just to see where things were at. And I saw significant change with her GI map. We had pretty much cleared all of the pathogens. A little bit of high proteus was still present. So we're continuing to work on that as far as the gut goes. We're also doing a lot of just probiotic and prebiotic support, because she was at a place on her second GI map where her microbiome was actually a little depleted compared to the first one. So we're trying to kind of just really build her up and work on restoring the mucosal barrier. On her urine mycotoxin test, great improvement. All of the mycotoxin levels are coming down. Some went from high to low moderate, but we're going the right direction. There's definitely still room to go. But given that, I think she retested maybe 2 or 3 months into the process of working on mycotoxin eradication. I was really happy with that lady, because I often will see clients that it doesn't go that fast, and we don't see that kind of progress with mold toxicity quite as fast. So she's been one of the just superstar clients that I've had as of late that has really seen some great results with the FDN approach to these types of things.
Oh, that's exciting. That's what, when you were talking about that first, I was like, okay, she's going to tell me about the protein. I was just going to ask you about retesting. I'm like, you laid it all out from start to finish.
Yeah.
And that's I love that you talked about, as you were waiting for different tests or deciding that we should probably go this direction, you still started with those foundations, talking about the nutrition and things that she could do regardless of a test.
Exactly.
So and I think that's so important, right? Because then you were actually able to monitor her energy or different things there. And that's really exciting. So where is she? How many months has she been working with you now at this point?
Oh gosh, I think she's about a year in, because we're in September. I think she started September of last year. And at this rate, we're down to less frequent touch points. She's really pretty much, I don't want to say on autopilot, because we're definitely still tweaking and adjusting things. And sometimes with the behavior change process, that does take a little bit of support, because life will change, stressors will come up. That has definitely been a piece that she's appreciated having that support in. But yeah, she's about a year in at this point, I would say.
Awesome. So you talked about a couple of specific labs that you ran in this case. What other kinds of labs come up a lot in the different case studies when you're sharing them, and what makes them useful?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of hormone testing, both,
Mhm.
adrenal, HPA axis, right, as well as sex hormone testing. And then particularly through, say, like a test like the Dutch test, right? You get also a read on the detoxification pathways, many of them. I mean, we can get a marker on the GI map that can indicate at least one detox pathway as well, which is helpful. And that's really important, again, especially in my practice, because I see so many people with overt GI symptomology, whether they've got an IBS or an IBD diagnosis, where a big part of what could be driving that is high toxic load and then not being able to like release these things, right? So I do like the Dutch for that purpose. I also like it for the purpose of getting a sense of where they at in terms of their stress response. Are they, overproducing cortisol, in terms of kind of the average, right? And that obviously can lead to a lot of downstream effects, including, damage to the mucosal barrier and the GI. Are they really, really tanked, right? Like some of these indicators can be very helpful in just giving context to what the client's reporting, and then giving me a sense of, all right, where is this person at a place where they can even handle a lot of, say, diet or lifestyle change. Sometimes people are so depleted when they come to us, we have to really start with very baby steps and kind of meet them where they're at and very slowly walk them in the right direction. So I do like the Dutch as a test. I use that quite frequently in my practice. I also like to do organic acids testing as well. And that test I find can be very helpful as an adjunct to the GI map, particularly the page 1 microbial markers, because what I've seen historically is that certain markers are a little bit easier, or I should say the organic acids test is a little bit more sensitive to certain microbial markers, including things like C. diff, right? Compared to the GI map, as well as something like Candida, which again, the GI map does assess for, but it isn't always going to be as accurate as, say, like an organic acids assessment of Candida markers. And then, of course, like blood work is excellent for that as well, because we can get pretty good black or white data as to whether or not we're seeing IgA or IgG antibodies elevated. And that being said, as we're talking blood work, Laini, I also love having a comprehensive blood work panel if you get it, right? Sometimes clients will come with that data if they've been seeing their PCP, recent to starting with me. It's maybe not quite as like comprehensive as I would, personally like to see, but like it's certainly data that we can use and correlate to some of these functional lab tests that we run. I'm just thinking through other tests that I've run, just beyond like urine mycotoxin testing, the total tox burden test from Vibrant. I really like that test as well, especially again, if it's a more complex person who maybe this isn't their first rodeo with a functional practitioner. They've already seen one or two others, and I'm asking them questions and they're saying, yeah, nobody's ever really looked at toxic load. And they're, reporting kind of the multiple symptoms, multiple systems of the body impacted. That definitely makes me think about potential for toxic load. So I do run that test quite a bit as well. And then I am a big fan of the wheat Zoomer as well at Vibrant. Sometimes I will do Zoomer bundles as well with that, simply because, again, in my world being very gut centric, I find a lot of people are just completely underappreciating or underrating how exposed they are to wheat. Either they're getting it here and there and they're sort of underrating, like, oh, it's not a big deal, I don't think I react, or they just don't realize that it is a big food trigger for them. And because that test also has such an extensive leaky gut panel, it can be really excellent for that, just to correlate back to like, okay, we've got this data that can tell us whether you're actually getting exposure to wheat and you're sensitive or not. And on top of that, we've got a really good read on just how leaky your gut is, which is always really helpful to correlate back to all of the other foundational tests. So, I would say those are the ones that I probably run the most often within just the functional testing sphere on my particular clients.
Awesome. You said something which I thought was great, especially about blood work or any of these things, right? Is that you're correlating them back to how the patient feels, the client feels.
Exactly.
And that's really important because nobody's doing that. So that's what's really important about these different functional lab tests that are looking at something deeper and saying, hey, yeah, this is showing up in your stress, in your cortisol rhythm throughout the day. Are you tired? Or are you like super wired? And they're like, oh my gosh, yes. And so that's really nice. You just talked about correlating back to how they're feeling. And then would you say that helps get more buy-in when you're offering a protocol or recommendations, because they actually see how their symptoms and how they're feeling is showing up in the data?
Oh, 100%. And a lot of times it's the experience of like, finally somebody gets it, right? Because yes, a lot of these clients, unfortunately, unless they've had some experience with a functional practitioner before, some of them have, but many of them haven't, they feel very dismissed and written off. Like they've gone into the doctor ad nauseum and had a lot of workups done and just nothing coming back. And the doctor might be very like sympathetic towards their case, but it's not the same thing as saying like, hey, we've run some tests, we've got some data. This is why you're having this. This correlates with the symptom, right? That can be very validating. And I think just you can feel like this anxiety come down when that happens. Yeah.
And would you say that you're able to do that with the blood work, right? Like they bring to you their blood work and their doctor has said, everything's fine, you're in the normal range. And they're like, no, but I don't feel well and I'm having these chronic symptoms. How do you help them interpret that blood work in a different manner?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So I will say with blood work, it always is good to have other testing to correlate it to, just to be really darn sure. But yeah, 100%. So first thing I explain to clients is that in functional health standards, we're always going to be using tighter ranges, right? Because we're not looking at just the average population, which is more similar to what, say, like conventional practitioners are doing with their lab ranges. We're looking at the optimal healthy part of the population. So therefore the controls on those ranges are going to be a lot tighter. And so when I'm able to actually put their lab work into a functional blood chem spreadsheet and sort of show them things that are out of range and what could be correlating to that, again, we often see a lot of just correlation with their symptoms, and sort of this picture that is starting to explain this pattern that they're struggling with. And then if on top of that I have, say, like a functional stool test, like a GI map, or organic acids, right, which can also get a read a little bit too on some of these vitamin nutrient deficiencies, we can sort of ascertain from blood work. That's even more powerful, because now we've got multiple tests that could all be correlating this picture that's sort of unfolding from looking at the blood chemistry.
Awesome. That leads perfectly into my next question. So many practitioners feel overwhelmed about some of these complex lab reports. For example, when someone sees a Dutch report for the first time, they're like, oh my gosh, how many pages are there, right? So how do you guide practitioners to simplify the interpretation and find what matters most, or what they should focus on and start on with their clients?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I don't know if I have like a one size fits all answer for that, because I think so much of it depends on the individual practitioner that I'm consulting with and their level of confidence with the particular test they're bringing to me. I would say if it's a really overwhelming situation, what I try to guide them towards is the low hanging fruit and the biggest imbalances first, right? Because it's kind of this idea that, let's say they've run 5 tests potentially, and we're doing this massive, case review together, and they're just like, oh my God, there's so much going on here. Part of what I try to help them with is just prioritize, like, what should we focus on first to start getting this person feeling better the fastest, right? Like, what's going to likely move the needle the fastest. Sometimes part of that conversation is informed by what the practitioner also tells me about their client as well. And so that can be a big part of the consulting process, where, I'm not only looking at the test, but that other practitioner is telling me, like, this is what I know about this client. They're not going to be compliant in taking 10 supplements. Like, they're only willing to take 5, right? Or they've got XYZ factor going on in their life. Like, they don't eat breakfast. I don't know. Maybe that's something that they're going to work with them on. But that can really help me too, because again, it's this idea that we want to set that client up for success. And although some of these lifestyle factors or maybe mindset factors the client comes in the door with aren't ideal, we're hoping we can adapt and get them to open up and be flexible with those things. The reality is we want to meet them where they're at and slowly nudge them in the right direction so we can increase their compliance and their confidence in the process as well. And I've just seen time and time again, if we go at change too hard and too fast, that can often cause the client to get very frustrated and fall off the wagon, right? So I think it's a bit of a dance between the practitioner's level of confidence and knowledge in interpreting and running protocols from the test and just helping orient them and prioritize them. And then also what I know about their client and what they're telling me and trying to sort of like merge that information together so that we can come up with a plan that feels like it's going to work for that client's particular circumstances and feel good for the practitioner. Like this is manageable for them to carry out and help guide their client through.
Yes, thank you. That's awesome. And I love that you brought in the fact that part of that is understanding what the client actually needs. What are their goals, right? Because I see oftentimes that practitioners will get these lab results and then they write the protocol that they think is best.
Yes.
Without remembering, did you listen to the client, what the client needs at this stage of the game? Right?
Exactly.
Because you want to know what they need so that they're more compliant. If you're doing something like you said, if you're asking them to eat protein and they've been a vegetarian forever,
right,
we've got to start in a different direction.
Exactly.
But building on that, so let's say you have someone come to you with a really challenging case, someone like your kidney person, right? So you've got an autoimmune condition, they know they have mold toxicity. They've been told that before. They know that they probably have heavy metals. They just had a root canal. Like all of these things are coming up at you. Yeah. What is your step-by-step process for identifying true healing opportunities? Where do you start when you meet this person for the first time?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it would be very similar to kind of the process I took with my autoimmune kidney client in that, we're always going to be considering what testing do we need to run to make sure we have data that's going to help us, right? And so again, depending on where this person's been, if they've never worked with a functional practitioner before, well, it sounds like you're kind of queuing it up where maybe they have, Laini, they've come in and they've got all this, right? So, I mean, I would, if that were the case and they actually had testing and it was like recent testing that is like what we would consider valid testing, gold standard testing, like they had a urine mycotoxin test, maybe a total tox burden, some heavy metals testing, that kind of thing. I think in that situation, I would have a deeper conversation around where they've been, if they've been working with someone else, what approach was taken, because obviously, depending on what that practitioner did, that's going to guide me to potentially, switch gears or not. All of us practice so differently, I guess. And part of what I'm trying to avoid is reinventing the same wheel and sending them down the same path that didn't work the first time. So I definitely think having that kind of conversation up front and just getting a sense of, well, what was tried in the past for this so that I can be aware that whatever I'm recommending going forward, we're not going down that same path if it didn't work. And then secondarily, I think a little bit of this is also kind of intuitive. Like if I feel like the approach they've come in the door with, having tried, is actually a pretty solid approach that I might take as well in a similar situation, that might indicate to me that this person either is just not at a level where they're quite ready yet for, say, going in and trying to like purge a bunch of gut pathogens or, detox a bunch of toxins. Like I truly feel like there are people where they're either so compromised, so depleted, or have such a high toxic load that we have to actually work a lot more with the lifestyle, diet, and mindset piece of things. And, even though it's such a buzzword, like, nervous system regulation, right? And there's a gazillion ways to do that. But I think less is more in situations like that where, honestly, Laini, I've even seen a lot of cases where clients have done kind of, to me, extensive supplementation and considering of things like toxic load, whether on their own or with another practitioner. But oddly, they really haven't done a deep dive on their diet. Like nobody's really sat down with them and looked at their food journal and like walked them through like, oh, I see you're eating these foods and this could be problematic. And, what if we actually swapped this for this and we changed this rate? Like they haven't actually done that level of basic, investigation with them. And I think, you always have to do that as part of like any good process, right? But especially with some of these like really complex people, like if they really haven't had a lot of deep nutritional guidance that's gotten them clear on like what is going to help them, you know, in terms of foods to eat and what to avoid in the diet, that definitely has to be foundational. So, you know, I think so much of it would just depend on the road they've been down and what's been tried. And if it's really been solid, then it's like, all right, let's do what we can with diet. Let's look at maybe some lifestyle factors, your sleep. To a certain extent, coaching wise, we can dive into mindset a little bit and kind of dig into that. But certainly there are complex enough cases where, you know, those clients might even benefit from being referred out to other specialized practitioners that really help them with deeper levels of, say, like emotional regulation or trauma release work, that type of thing, which, you know, as you know, almost always to some degree plays a role in chronic unresolving illness, where there's going to be that more energetic emotional component, which can be quite deep. And then again, not necessarily in the scope of a lot of just functionally trained practitioners like me, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really important and people need to hear that. Talk about the history, what's worked for them in the past. I was thinking of SIBO in particular. How many SIBO clients come and say they've worked with this practitioner and it went away for a while and then it's back. And then they worked with this practitioner and it went away and then it came back. And then they've done that with multiple practitioners and they're so frustrated. And in reality, a conversation to understand their lifestyle or their nutrition or all of these other triggers that could be causing that to reoccur, right? You know, there's these other parts of the puzzle that people aren't talking about. But aside from that, so I think sometimes we do have to back off, right? Sometimes less is more in those cases, and letting people not be so stressed out or always jumping to find, oh yeah, you need this test and this test and this test and this protocol, right?
Exactly.
And giving them a minute to take a breath and be okay. So I think that was very valuable what you said. Now, flipping direction though, is there a time where combining labs like stool, hormone, and blood chemistry helps create clarity? So this one is let's say this is a new client that's come in. They have some weight loss, some brain fog, you know, they're not sleeping well, they feel stressed out, and they have maybe a skin condition. And they're like, where do we start? Can I just bring you my blood test, Courtney? Is that going to be enough?
Yeah, no, such a great question. I mean, it's funny you're asking this question because as FDNs, it's kind of like drilled into us, like, don't just run one singular test,
Right.
which is why the program's set up to teach us 5 foundational labs. And whether you stick with those 5 or you expand your learning and you choose from other tests, you know, that's kind of on you. But I mean, I've just seen since I've come out of the FDN program that truly it can be very limiting, and there's always going to be some degree of uncertainty or some degree of like, did I miss something if I only ran one test? And maybe even just to give a quick story to back this up, because I've had, gosh, I mean, before I became an FDN, obviously I was working as a nutrition therapy practitioner. That was my original certification through the Nutrition Therapy Association, which was also an excellent foundation. I started with lingual neurotesting, which was using supplementation on the tongue, checking different reflex points on the body as like my kind of body-based testing method, which can be helpful, but I also feel there are limitations to that type of testing. And so some of my longstanding clients that just kind of stick with me for occasional maintenance work or just, you know, ongoing support started way back then, Laini, and this was before I was running functional lab testing. And I'm thinking of one in particular who has been a longstanding client. She's made a lot of improvements in her health, but one problem we could not resolve because we, you know, and she was a little bit more when we started doing testing, she's like, well, let's just do like one test at a time. Okay, right. So I ran a GI map on her because she had a history of acid reflux. That was one of her primary issues. That definitely got better with diet change and with some supplementation. And, you know, but there was still some degree of like issue there. And so on her original GI map, she had high H. pylori, which, you know, correlates with things like acid reflux. And so I'm like, okay, well, now we definitely see we've got that problem. Let's go ahead and run a protocol, try to help you get rid of that. So ran that protocol. I think I might have done either some saliva hormone testing, I don't know if I ever ran a Dutch on her, but we've run some piecemeal tests here and there. And she was one that actually too would go see her doctor for checkups. And she had a long history of low iron. I mean, really low iron, where she was getting, iron infusions for a long time just to stay, stable. And I was like, that actually could be correlated with some of the acid reflux and low stomach acid and H. pylori if it's long-standing. And also there could be some malabsorption issues going on in the small intestine, just depending on that, right? So anyhow, I would look at all this and then we would do these protocols, rerun the GMAP, could not clear this H. pylori. We would knock it down, but it just wasn't resolving. And then Candida was also starting to show up too, as we did more testing, repeat testing on her. And, finally I got to this place where I'm like, maybe we just run a hair tissue mineral analysis. I don't run it a lot, but I sort of want to make sure we're not dealing with any other strange things that might explain, because she had some degree of hormonal issues and that type of thing going on, and weight loss resistance. So I just, on a whim ran that on her, and she had really high copper excretion coming out in the hair. And I was like, oh my God, this would make sense why, potentially the H. pylori isn't clearing. We know that can be a buffer for things like metals and mold toxins and Candida. And we know that Candida and copper go hand in hand in the body. If we've got excess copper that the body's holding on to, Candida can tend to overgrow, right? And so that was really interesting, because the HTMA isn't a test I necessarily always pull out and use on every single client case. But once you start to go down that path and you're doing more and more of this, you'll start to get these little intuitive hits like, gosh, what could be here that we haven't checked? And I think I even ran a provoked urine metals test on her just to see, and nothing significant. Then we get this HTMA and I was like, oh my God, this is it, and so that was really interesting, Laini. But it goes to show that when you're just doing piecemeal testing, you can get some part of the way there, right? You're always any data you get is going to be helpful, and it's going to get a client going in the right direction. But the ones that get stuck and the ones that don't get full resolution, certainly that can be because you just don't have enough of the information and you haven't run enough testing to get at the other major root cause drivers that are explaining why they've got these symptoms going on. So that just kind of comes to mind as I'm thinking about this, right?
Yes, thank you. That's, as an FDN practitioner myself, sometimes people will ask, clients will ask, well, do we have to do all of these? And I say, well, here's the deal. My background is personal training. And so an assessment as a personal trainer was, you came in, I put you on the scale, I took your measurements, and then we set a goal.
Yeah.
That was the data that I took to make your protocol. And that worked for some people and not for others. And so I explained to them, I need to get your physiological data. I need to know what your body is saying. We want to get all of that data, so our approach is very strategic and individualized for you. And they're like, whoa, that's so fascinating, right? So it's a really powerful thing to be able to tell someone, no, we're going to investigate your actual, what's going on with you and what's going on inside your body. So when we give you recommendations, they are strategic, they are meant for you and your lifestyle. I think that's really what's so powerful about the FDN methodology.
Yes,
So
exactly. Powerful. Spot on.
So for practitioners who are new to FDN or functional lab work, what's the best first step to start applying these kinds of insights and principles?
Oh, so assuming they're already trained FDNs or trained functional practitioners?
Yeah. Yep. Let's say they are a practitioner, but they're new and they're like, how do I put this all together?
Yeah. I mean, I think the simplest advice to give is, honestly, with the testing, stick with what you know well, right? I know that's kind of been a bit of an observation just on the clinical advising side of things, is there can be a bit of a tendency right out of the gate when you're certified to have this whole gamut of everything open to you like a buffet. And it's like, oh my gosh, organic acids and the Dutch and the HTMA, right? And I'm going to run them all, right? And I mean, you can, but I think it can be a slippery slope. And that's where, again, I think the big piece of becoming really confident and solid in how you're applying your work with clients is to sort of take it one step at a time and really master what you've been taught and feel really good on that level first before you go down the next rabbit hole. And, just even thinking about my own evolution as a practitioner, I worked with my original NTP certification framework for a long time before I got stuck. And then I'm like, you know what? I feel like I just don't have all of the pieces I need to really understand some of these situations. And then that led me to the next thing. And then eventually that led me to the next thing. Right. And so I think just staying in that zone of where you feel confident and competent as a practitioner. And obviously, if you're an FDN or you're working with Biocanic, you have the clinical advising team at your disposal as well as a second check. And then the basics, right? Like the foundations, like we've been talking about through this conversation. I just think again and again, this is an area that we really should feel good about our knowledge and skills we bring to the table, because just from what I've seen, in the functional medicine space, especially if it's a practitioner that's crossing over from conventional to functional medicine, they still might not be getting a very deep education on nutrition or even coaching techniques or even lifestyle things, right? And so it's very common, I think, for people out in the consumer space to go start maybe there, and they're getting new testing, offered to them with some of the tests which we could offer as well. And they're getting supplements and maybe less problematic drugs because this person might be able to prescribe, but they're not necessarily being taught how to eat in a way that's going to help them restore health, or taking a look at their lifestyle and their sleep habits and all of those other really important things, because sometimes those practices are still operating more on kind of that medical model where it's a lot more limited to just testing and supplementation or testing and pharmaceuticals, right?
Totally. Yes. Oh my goodness. This has been so much fun, Courtney. I love having these conversations with you. But we are going to transition to audience Q&A now. So thanks to everybody who's been posting questions. We're going to get to as many as we can. And if you're watching this as a replay, feel free to post questions in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a live stream. All right, well, our first question, does FDN have a place where they share case studies so I can dig in and apply some of the knowledge in my own practice?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think when they run a lot of events that are targeted towards the public, right? To sort of showcase how FDN methodology works. I know I participated in many of them, like I'm thinking of Holistic Health Week in particular. And I don't remember the particulars, Laini. I don't think that there was a fee maybe to register for it when I've done it in the past, like for just the average person interested. But I think if they wanted the replays, there might have been like some nominal upgrade or something. But don't quote me on that. There might be actually some resources out there that are recorded that people can take advantage of. And I'm pretty sure that FDN, if you just go to the homepage, they have like a free training that they offer as like an opt-in, right? So if you're interested in starting that process of understanding what that certification is like, I think that you do have access to that, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, if you're listening to this on September 11th, next week is the 5 labs in 5 days. I think that kicks off next week.
Yep, they do
and
that.
So there is a small fee to sign up for that. However, you get to actually learn about 5 different labs, right?
Yep.
So that's a pretty good opportunity if you're new to these and want to learn more.
Exactly.
All right. What common mistakes do you see practitioners make when they're interpreting labs and assessments?
Ooh, what common mistakes? Well, it's kind of hard to pick one, but I guess it's mistakes plural, right? So I think I would say sometimes it's just fine tuning their understanding of certain lab markers. Like for example, just use a GI map as an example. There's a secretory IgA marker on there. Often it can be high or low, right? And sometimes when I'm doing consults with FDN practitioners, they'll want to, like, one of the strategies we might use, for example, is to use immunoglobulin support if it's low. And so if the test they're showing me shows it high, they might say, oh, so I do, immunoglobulin for this. And I'm like, well, not that it's going to be harmful, but it's not really designed for when it's high. So it can sometimes be some of those like little bit of like reversals in terms of understanding, like if the marker's high, they sort of forget. If it's high, maybe don't do that as much. If it's low, yes, this can be supportive. So that's common. I think sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming for a new practitioner to also understand which supplements to use, which ones are going to be effective, specific to, like, say, the GI map, especially, depending on which pathogens are showing up. And then also understanding how long to use the supplements and the dosing, right? So not that they're making mistakes, Lainey, but I feel like just some level of confusion can happen there, where it can be helpful for me to literally give them, like, hey, like, this would be the recommended time based on how much of this is showing up. Sometimes I have to remind them of the FDN order of operations when we're dealing with multiple co-infections, so that, they're really clear on how to approach that. And then I think, like, just a biggie is, again, and this is not just FDNs, it's any practitioner that runs testing, like, just not getting too overly consumed in fixing every little thing on the test, right? Because there's a lot you could potentially do if it's a test with a lot of imbalances. Really taking into context, like, do we really want to, like, address all of these things? Because this could be an overwhelming amount of supplements, versus could we maybe support the client a little bit more with diet and lifestyle, and then just address these big things that we're seeing, like some of the biggest things on the test. So that's another thing that I find pretty commonly comes up.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Next question. How do you coach practitioners to translate complex findings into language that clients can easily understand? Right? Because when you and I sit down and have this conversation, we're talking about mycotoxins and copper toxicity, and that's kind of overwhelming for someone. So how does a practitioner learn how to speak in terms of the client will understand and be able to take into their, I want to do this?
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually a question I do get in clinical advising sessions quite frequently. So my best answer to this is, I like to use just a lot of analogies, a lot of visuals, a lot of analogies I think people could understand. We just touched on secretory IgA. One conversation I have very frequently on consults with FDN practitioners, and we see this frequently on the GI map, is like a low secretory IgA marker in the context of kind of like a mediocre anti-gliadin IgA marker, which is a antibody to gliadin peptide, right, which is a component of wheat. And FDN methodology teaches that, hey, if you have low secretory IgA, you aren't going to get a very accurate read on your anti-gliadin IgA, because we don't have enough gas in the tank to support the immune system to get like a robust enough response. And so often I'll give the analogy of, it's like, imagine your immune system is like the army, or, a troop of forces, right? And you've got like half of them laying on the ground because they're kind of out and down right now, right? Like, you're not going to get this full attack against whatever that enemy is. And in this case, let's say it's the gluten peptide, the gluten protein that we're attacking. It's not going to show like the full capacity if part of your army is sort of incapacitated. But if we could restore that, we would have a much different response. So I'll use those kinds of analogies just to kind of give them ideas as to how to use languaging that their client might be able to actually visualize and understand some of these concepts a little better.
I absolutely love that analogy. That's a great one. I think that's really good information to be able to talk in these analogies and explain things. I use analogies with the stress bucket all the time, right? Yeah. If your stress bucket's overflowing, you can't put any more in it, right? Or if you always giving all of your energy away, how are you supposed to have any energy in the tank, right? Exactly. These different little analogies. And I use my hands all the time when I do that too. I'm not going to right now. That's right. But saying, we have to, if you're going to stress this much, you've got to restore this much, and you've got to keep it balanced. So that's pretty interesting. So what I'm hearing is that for any practitioner, FDN or otherwise, there's a lot of correlations that we can look at multiple lab tests. We can look at assessments. We can talk to the client themselves. And sometimes that's a lot of information and we don't know where to start. And to help us, we could actually schedule a consult with you or one of the other FDN consult team. Yeah. So how do we go about doing that, Courtney?
Yeah. So if you go to the FDN website, under the Medical Director Program tab, you should be able to see, and this is like, I guess for Biocanic, is this how you guys would do it too? I'm not even entirely sure, Laini.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I know that there's an ability to schedule through the website, right? Like, I'm not entirely sure how people would do that, but I know internally FDNs have the ability through their portal, right? Like to go ahead and like schedule, purchase a session and schedule. But with Biocanic, I'm not entirely sure how that works.
So as if you're using Biocanic and doing any kind of online test ordering, which we do right inside the platform, one of the options is to order an FDN medical consult. So you can actually purchase a 30-minute consult right there in Biocanic and have the opportunity to talk with one of these practitioners and get some insight into your testing, your case, and actually give you a little confidence as you move forward. So that's pretty cool. One more question that just came in. Have you seen any recurring patterns in consultations that practitioners should pay attention to? So what things are showing up often in your particular consults or even with your clients that people should be aware of or kind of be mindful of?
Yeah, I think lots of patterns of a lot of depletion, just a lot of depletion. And kind of the sense is you'll see really low digestive markers on the GI map, sometimes multiple pathogens. If there's some sort of, stress hormone profile along with it, you'll see cortisol and DHEA in the compensatory or even the exhaustive phase. Asking questions about the client case, I get indicators that like the client might be not sleeping well, has a lot on their plate responsibility wise. They might be like doing a lot of high intensity exercise frequently throughout the week. Just a lot, just people being very overloaded and very resource depleted. That seems to be a very common pattern that I see, not just in my practice, but also consulting with a lot of FDNs that are bringing their cases to me.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's one that people tend to overlook, right? They're like, okay, I've got headaches. I've got this. Okay. Are you getting sleep? Are you getting enough nutrition? Yes, we could do the testing, but those foundations, which I think is really great that you touched on multiple times today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Courtney.
Yeah.
Before we go, what would be your number one, Courtney, not number 2 or 3, number one piece of advice that you would give to practitioners out there after doing a lot of consulting with FDNs? What's that piece of advice that FDNs or any practitioners could use?
Oh gosh. I would honestly say it. I know I've mentioned it throughout this entire talk, but I think meeting your client where they're at, and this is more for the practitioner, but give yourself grace because some of these folks are definitely more complicated nowadays. I feel like there's a lot going on with the clients we serve. And I think it comes with experience, but I think it's just remembering that like, it's not your responsibility to like, quote unquote, fix them, right? Like our job is to run appropriate testing, teach them, educate them, coach them, and guide them. But remember, the client is responsible for the lion's share of the work too, right? So I think it's just meeting them where they're at and then doing the best you can to walk the path with them. But if you reach roadblocks and challenges, just giving yourself grace, because I know in my practice, I've just seen a lot of very complex situations that I thought like, oh man, I don't know how I would have handled this a year out of like my certification. This would have been really, really tough. So yeah, that's what I would leave you with.
Oh, thank you. I think that's so important to let practitioners know you are doing a good job. You don't have to know it all. There's always going to be a case that comes in that's going to feel a little overwhelming. So stick to the foundations and just know that there's opportunities for support like FDN Consults to help lead you through that. Absolutely. So thanks so much, Courtney. If you're listening to this podcast, be sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our live streams. Our next one is in 2 weeks. We will have Jen Evan from Diagnostic Solutions. So we're going to be talking about GI map tests, I think. And in our Hicks community, join us next Tuesday on the 16th at 2 p.m. Pacific time for another Business Practices with Jen Maleka and the Biocanic team. Again, on Thursday, September 18th at 2 p.m. Pacific. And another episode with Precision Protocol Series with Brendan Vermeer. And he and Jeremy will be talking about neural inflammation and brain health. So we have a lot of education coming at you here in the next couple of weeks. So hit subscribe, join us, and we hope to see you there. Thanks, Courtney. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye, Laini.